Hello and welcome to another chapter of Measle and the Wrathmonk by Ian Ogilvy, illustrated by Mould and published by Oxford University Press. Where we had left off in the previous chapter, Measle and the rest of the victims had managed to find their way into the control box for the train set, and had managed to kind of hold themselves up in there to keep themselves safe from the cockroach that Basil had turned into. The cockroach was trying to get to them even inside the steel box, and Measle knew that he needed to come up with a plan, because as long as that cockroach remained on the train set, they were not safe. And he came up with a plan. Frank didn't like the plan. We didn't know what the plan was, but I get the feeling we're about to find out what that plan is in this chapter. So this is us now, chapter 9. There's only 2 chapters to go now. This is the second last one. This is chapter 9, The Engine. In a wide arc around the control box, the tabletop had been left bare. But 30 centimetres away from the steel housing, the green-painted sandpaper began, and within another 15 centimetres there was the start of the forest. Measle sat across the tabletop, his heart thumping in his chest. Tinker, seeming to sense the importance of their mission, trotted quietly at his side. They moved as silently as possible between the trees, walking roughly in the direction of the town square. Measle was trying as hard as he could to picture in his mind the entire layout of the train set. He concentrated particularly on the rail line that ran from the dirty railway yard through the outskirts of town and into the forest. He reckoned that if he and Tinker kept walking in a straight line, they should come across the tracks fairly soon, and moments later, there they were, gleaming in the morning light. He stepped onto the line and looked left and right. To his left, about 60 centimetres away, the tracks disappeared in a wide turn that Measle knew led back towards town. To his right, the tracks led away in a straight line for several centimetres, and Measle could see, in the far distance, the point where they met the very edge of the table. There, the line made a sharp turn to the right, and Measle knew that the track ran alongside the edge of the table for most of its length. Then, at the table's end, it made another wide arc before doubling back on itself. "This is where we do it, Tinker," he said. "I just hope I can run as fast as you can. Come on." They began to walk between the rail lines, stepping on each broad railway sleeper and avoiding the loose gravel that lay between them. Measle tried a short run, and yes, it was possible to get quite a good speed up, leaping from sleeper to sleeper, until his foot slipped and he hit the gravel, instantly tripping and falling hard on the sharp stones. He sat there for a moment, pressing his scraped hands to his chest, and Tinker stood quietly by his side with a puzzled look on his face. Was this part of the plan? He thought. Or is it 'cause the nice smelly kid just ain't good at running? Of course, 4 legs is better than 2. Stands to reason, doesn't it? Measle got to his feet, patted Tinker on the head, and they began to walk again. They followed the line as it curved round to the right. On either side, the trees seemed to press in against them, and once they had passed the long bend, Measle was relieved to see the dirty railway yard buildings in the distance. He could just make out the hulking shape of the big black locomotive, its huge cowcatcher striking out in front like a set of buck teeth. The engines seemed to be crouching, ready to leap forward at a moment's notice. They walked on for a few more metres, and then, as Measle had expected, they came to a point where the forest thinned suddenly on the left-hand side of the tracks. Here, Basil had left a broad open area in which he'd set the logging camp. Small huts stood on either side of the muddy track. The logging mill itself was set by the side of the tracks, and Measle could see the dusty machinery in its gloomy interior. There were the stumps of newly cut trees everywhere, and one even had an axe head embedded deeply into it, its handle sticking up at an angle. Measle and Tinker left the tracks and set off up the muddy track, which was of course not muddy at all. It was perfectly dry, but Basil had scrunched up the newspaper here and painted it brown so that it looked like rutted potholed pathway through the woods. The track twisted this way and that, but most of the turns were to the right, and Measle knew that quite soon they would reach the outskirts of town. "Can you see him?" Kip called up to Kitty, who was standing on top of the box. "I can see his flag," she called back. "Where is he now?" "He's almost at the edge of town, just coming out of the trees along the dirt road." "Good," called Kip. "Keep your eyes fastened on that flag." He turned to Frank, who was standing by the row of connectors, the red cable in his hands. "Ready?" he said. Frank nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." "This is the hard part," Measle thought, as he and Tinker cleared the last of the trees and stepped onto the edge of town. This is the part where luck has to take over. The houses here were in the form of small cottages, all stuck together in a line on either side of the street. Each little house had a small front yard, and in these areas stood the rubbish bins, 2 for each house. They were the old-fashioned sort, made of galvanised corrugated steel, with round lids, each with a handle on it. Measle went to the nearest house and took the lids off 2 of the bins. He held them up like cymbals. "I'm going to make a lot of noise now, Tinker," he said. "This is it," he said to himself. "It's now or never." Measle raised the 2 steel lids high in the air, separating them as far as his arms could stretch. He swallowed once, gritted his teeth, and then brought his hands together as hard as he could, and the steel lids crashed together with a great clanging sound that seemed to bounce off the walls of the cottages, echoing back and forth between the houses. Tinker dropped to the ground, his stubby tail between his legs. What was the smelly kid doing? Oh no, he's doing it again. Crash, clang, smash, bang. Well, whatever the smelly kid was doing, it looked as if he was enjoying himself, so Tinker decided that this was all part of some new game. A musical game, perhaps. He jumped to his feet, his tail high. He lifted his head and started to howl, a high-pitched yodeling yell that mixed horribly with the discordant crashes of the steel lids. Crash, oh, bang, oh, smash, oh, bash, oh. And in the town hall square, the cockroach's antennae turned. They turned in the direction of the sound. Basil, or what remained of Basil inside the giant roach, had suffered an unpleasant night. Being an insect was bad enough, but being attacked by his own little pet was an appalling state of affairs. That he'd survived the night at all was due entirely to the fact that he'd managed to control the suicidal tendencies of the body he was inhabiting. There was just enough of Basil's brain, mixed in with the brain of the monster insect, to override the mindless instincts of the cockroach. The creature had wanted to turn and face its attacker, but Basil's superior mind had managed to force it to turn its hard, slippery back to the bat, and at the same time cling with all the strength in its massive claws to the walls and floor of the half-demolished town hall. It was lucky that Cuddlebug also had a reasonable intelligence for a bat, because after scrabbling uselessly at the hard wing cases of the cockroach for 10 minutes, he had decided that the insect simply wasn't worth all this effort, and that there would be almost certainly be easier pickings somewhere else. So, as suddenly as it had begun, Cuddlebug had stopped his attack and flown off through the high attic window and into the night outside. And Basil, once again overriding the roach's natural instincts, which were to scuttle about the place looking for scraps of food, had held tight to the wall and the floor of the shattered building for a further 10 minutes, just in case Cuddlebug had decided to come back and try again. Once it was clear that the bat had gone for good, Basil had scuttled across the table and had spent another frustrating few hours trying in vain to get that filthy little Measle together with his little plastic victims who had, and this was the most infuriating and puzzling part of it all, somehow come back to life. And now, both he and his cockroach host were very, very hungry. Basil was also in a savage fury, and this clashing, crashing, banging sound somewhere at the edge of the town was making his brain ache. Dimly in his muddled mind, he realised that the noise was almost certainly being made by that horrible boy. For who else was there? His plastic victims somehow were no longer plastic, so it was possible that they were responsible. But no, only a dirty, filthy, sneaky boy could be causing such a racket. Basil turned his great body so that he faced the direction from which the noise was coming. He waved his long antennae in the air, tasting the scent atoms that blew in the slight breeze. "Oh yes, it was him, that foul little Measle. You should have disposed of him years ago. Well, he'd dispose of him now. He'd dispose of him and eat him, starting with his head and working his way slowly all the way down to his toes. And that would be the end of the filthy creature, oh yes." Basil heaved himself forward and with gathering speed began to scuttle towards the sound. Tinker smelt the cockroach long before Measle saw it. The dog suddenly stopped howling and turned his nose in the direction of the town centre. He crouched low, his stubby tail tucked between his hind legs and the wiry hair on his shoulders rising into a stiff crest, and a low rumbling growl sounding deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" said Measle, halting his lead bashing for a moment. Tinker growled again, his nostrils twitching. "Is it coming?" Measle asked, the pitch of his voice rising through fear. Tinker darted him a quick glance as if to say, "Of course it is. Of course it's coming. Can't you smell it?" And then, rounding a corner at the end of the street, came the great black cockroach, its antennae waving furiously and all 6 legs pumping back and forth as it scuttled towards them. Measle dropped both steel lids to the ground with a crash and turned and fled, Tinker close behind him. Inside the control box, all eyes were staring upwards through the ceiling slots. "What's happening, dear?" asked Prudence. "I'm not sure," called back Kitty. "Could you hear the noise?" They all heard it. Tinker's howls and the crashing of the steel lids were way in the distance, but they had heard the sounds quite clearly. "Is there any movement?" called Kip. "No, not yet. Wait, the noise has stopped. Yes, I can see the flag. It's starting down the Measle road. It's moving fast and the cockroach is chasing him." "Tell us when he reaches the railway tracks," shouted Frank. "Any minute now," said Kip quietly. Frank nodded and moved his hand holding the red cable to a little nearer to the row of connectors. Measle and Tinker raced down the wide path. Behind them, and getting steadily nearer and nearer, was the pounding, scratching sound of the roach's claws. Sometimes they heard the sound of a tree breaking and falling as the great insect bulldozed its way down the track towards them. By the time they reached the railway tracks, Measle was panting with exhaustion. Tinker's tongue was lolling out of the corner of his mouth, but he looked as if he could run forever. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were getting louder. Measle reckoned that the cockroach was just now reaching the far edge of the logging village, which meant that at its present rate of speed, the monster would be on top of them in 15 seconds. Measle made a quick decision. He risked 5 of those precious seconds to reach behind him and grab the stick in his belt. He pulled it clear and waved it frantically, reaching up as far as he could, the little red flag fluttering wildly in the air. And look, there's Measle running across the tracks waving the red flag. Kitty's voice was a high-pitched scream. "He's at the tracks! He's waving the flag! The cockroach is... Oh no, the cockroach is almost there! Wait, Measle's moving again. He's moving fast down the tracks. The cockroach is right behind him!" "Now!" shouted Kip. Frank turned and touched the exposed end of the red cable to the first yellow wire. Kip looked back towards the ceiling slot. "Is there a train moving?" he shouted. There was a pause. Then Kitty called down, her voice desperate. "It's the wrong one! It's the little freight train, and it's going backwards! Try a different one!" Kip nodded to Frank, and Frank moved the red wire to the next yellow one in line. "What now?" called Kip. Another pause, and then Kitty's voice breaking with panic. No, not that one. That's the passenger train, and it's on the far end of the table. Do another one." Frank touched the cable end to the third wire. Measle's legs felt like lumps of hot lead. The effort of running across the sleepers and avoiding the gravel in between them was enormous. The railway tracks stretched out in front of him, as straight as an arrow to the far edge of the table. Measle knew that they were, in fact, only a few metres behind him in the sharp curve at the end, but it looked like a kilometre at least, and he wasn't sure he was going to make it. He pounded on, his heart thumping in his chest and his feet slapping down in each sleeper in turn. Tinker ran beside him, occasionally throwing a look backwards and growling deep in his throat. The sound of breaking trees had stopped, and that meant only one thing. The roach was on the tracks now. And by the steady increasing volume of these scraping claws against the iron rails, it was gaining on them rapidly. Measle knew he wouldn't make it. It was too far to the edge of the table. He was too tired. And where was the expected sound of the great locomotive? It should be moving by now. It should be on the very tracks that were running along. He should be able to hear it, but he could hear nothing, except his own rasping breaths, his feet slapping on the railway sleepers, and the terrifying sound of scraping and scrabbling as the scratching and hissing and all too close behind him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Tinker skip to a stop. He ran on a few paces and then halted himself. He turned and saw Tinker racing back along the tracks, straight towards the great insect. "No!" he yelled. "Tinker, come back!" But Tinker didn't come back. Tinker had had enough. All this running around and making loud noises was all very well, but no self-respecting dog was going to allow himself to be chased by a bug. It may be the size of a house, but huge, nasty, dangerous-looking fangy thingies in its mouth. But what does that matter? It smells like a bug, and that makes it a bug. Just a stupid old bug, and I'm a dog, and dogs ain't scared of bugs. It's the only other way around it, isn't it? And now the smelly kid is yelling something, probably telling me to go for it. Right, I'll go for it. I'll show the smelly kid what I'm made of. Okie dokie. Let's start with the growly, snarly, show the old toothies routine, shall we? And Tinker, his lips pulled back in what he hoped would look like the most savage of savage snarls, bunched the muscles of his short back legs and accelerated towards the giant cockroach. And look, there's Tinker running towards the cockroach. What's going to happen to Tinker? For a moment, faced with the onrushing dog, Basil forgot what he was and felt a moment of fear. He'd always hated dogs. They scared him. Those teeth, that noise they made whenever they saw him. He'd always avoided dogs, apart from this one, and he'd felt nervous all the time when it was near him. He'd managed to threaten the old woman when he'd caught her spying on him, telling her to keep the dog away from him, or he'd do something really nasty to them both. Once he'd got them inside his house, he locked them in a dark, damp cupboard under the stairs and had turned them both tiny by blowing hard through the keyhole. But now, here was this full-sized dog racing towards him, snapping and snarling and frothing at the mouth. And Basil stopped, his huge claws skidding across the railway sleepers and crunching against the gravel. Tinker stopped too. He lowered his head and snarled, showing off his white teeth. The cockroach did nothing for a moment, and a few metres down the track, Measle watched as the dog-sized Tinker and the elephant-sized insect warily stared at each other. Then Basil remembered what he was. He was a giant cockroach. This tiny creature couldn't hurt him. Its little teeth were no match for his curved mandibles. Its soft skin couldn't compete with his hard shell. Any damage that was going to be done would be done by him. Basil lunged forward, and Tinker neatly sidestepped the great insect and circled round to its side, barking furiously. Basil heaved his huge body round to face the dog and lunged forward again and again, and Tinker jumped backwards and out of reach. Slowly they circled each other, Basil moving ponderously forward, his curved jaws snapping, and Tinker jumping at the last second and out of reach of the attacks and barking continuously. In the control box, Frank had almost run out of wires to touch. He tried them all, and each time Kitty, her voice rising with hysteria, had called down that it was the wrong train, and now there were only one connector left. "It's got to be this one," he muttered. "It's just got to be." He touched the red end of the cable to the last of the connectors. Measle had seen enough. It looked as if Tinker was well able to fend for himself, and this was an opportunity to get where he wanted to be. He turned and ran down the track towards the distant table edge. Behind him, he heard the sound of Tinker's barking, and the cockroach's furious hissing dwindle as he raced away. Within half a minute, he'd reached his goal, where the railway tracks met the edge of the table. It made a hard turn to the right, and this would be where he would make his stand. If only the train would come. He felt it long before he saw it. He was standing near the edge of the vast table, with one foot resting against the left rail, and as he watched the distant battle, Tinker still leaping nimbly away from Basil's ponderous attacks, Basil heaving his massive body round to face the dog again, he became aware of a slight tingling vibration in his toes. He looked down. The rail seemed normal, and yet he could feel it distinctly now. A trembling, a faint pulsation, which quivered through his foot, into his ankle and up his leg. He dropped to his knees and put one ear to the cold steel, and there was a thrumming sound in his head that grew steadily louder and louder and louder. And there, far away up the railway tracks, just rounding the gentle curve, came the great black locomotive, its pistons pounding, its wheels a blur, and its massive cowcatcher skimming the rails towards him. Tinker and the gigantic insect were too busy sparring with each other to notice what was bearing down on them, and Measle saw that unless he did something fast, there was a good chance that Tinker would be hit by the train. He put his fingers in his mouth and blew a piercing whistle, and Tinker jerked his head in Measle's direction. "What's he want, that smelly kid? Can't he see I'm busy here? And there's that whistling noise again. Does that mean he needs me? Maybe it's time to go. This fight's getting a bit boring. And now there's a funny noise too. It's getting louder and louder. It's a bit scary, this funny noise. And now it's getting so loud that it's not so funny after all. And that means, yep, time to go. Measle saw Tinker suddenly leave the battle and begin to race towards him. His ears flattened, his legs stretched out in a breakneck gallop. And he saw the giant roach turn as well and begin to scuttle after Tinker, its 6 legs pumping back and forth as it gathered speed. And behind the roach, gaining on it rapidly, came the great, smoke-belching, wheel-screaming, piston-packing, rail-rattling locomotive. Measle stood perfectly still. There was nothing left for him to do. Whatever was going to happen would happen now without any interference from him, just as long as the cockroach stayed between the tracks. Then, Tinker, tiring of running across the railway sleepers and scratching his paws in the gravel between them, veered suddenly sideways, running off the tracks and onto the painted grass at the side, and the great cockroach veered away too, off the tracks and out of danger. Out of danger of the black pointed cowcatcher in the front of the huge locomotive, Measle thought desperately. Then he started to yell, jumping up and down in the middle of the railway lines, waving his red flag as hard as he could, frantically trying to get the roach's attention away from Tinker and onto himself. And Basil saw the red flag, and under it, the nasty, dirty, leaping figure of the boy he hated far more than he hated any stupid little dog. The boy was jumping up and down in the middle of the tracks, and Basil forgot about chasing the stupid little dog and changed direction again, scrambling back between the railway lines. And now he was almost there and could see in his muddled mind's eye how he was going to flatten the filthy boy, flatten him and eat him, start him with the top of his head and working his way to the soles of his feet. He was almost there, and just as Basil reared his huge body forward to squash Measle flat, Measle hurled himself to one side off the railway tracks and onto the painted grass at the side, rolling as he landed and keeping rolling sideways until his body thumped against the tree of a trunk of a tree. Basil could never shift direction as fast as that. In a straight line he could get up a terrific speed, but the great mass of his cockroach body could never perform an agile move like Measle's, so he merely slowed down his forward pace and laboriously began the process of shifting his great body sideways. He was too late. The massive cowcatcher in the front of the locomotive, skimming a centimetre above the rails, slammed into him, catching his body from underneath and flipping it high into the air. And look, there's the cockroach getting chased by the train. Is Measle's plan working? Measle watched as the huge cockroach turned end over end, spinning upwards towards the attic ceiling. He felt the blast of winds of the locomotive with 3 dusty Pullman carriages shrieked by. He saw the locomotive going at full speed now, hit the sharp turn, rock violently from side to side, its small front wheels grabbing at the bends into the rails, and then the entire engine seemed to leap half a metre into the air as it left the tracks, hurtling straight overhead over the edge of the table. He heard the crash as it hit the attic wall, and then 3 successive crashes as the Pullmans hit as well. He looked up again and saw that Basil's spinning upward flight was slowing down, and at any moment he would begin the inevitable descent back towards the tabletop. And Measle saw, with a sudden flash of horror, that Basil wouldn't fall over the edge of the table as he'd hoped he would. No, the cowcatcher had flipped Basil straight up into the air and not sideways at all, which meant that Basil was going to land on the tabletop. Measle knew that no matter how high you dropped a cockroach, their hard outer shell always protected them from harm. So it looks like Measle's plan isn't going to work after all. High in the rafters, Cuddlebug stirred. There was so much noise down there. Far more noise than usual. Crashing and smashing and bashing. This noise was very disturbing to a bat's sleep. Very disturbing indeed. So disturbing, in fact, that Cuddlebug opened one eye. And here was lunch. It was very strange. Lunch had never come to him before. He always had to seek lunch out, find lunch, catch lunch, and only then eat lunch. And here, and it looked as, and yet here was lunch spinning up towards his roost in a very peculiar flight pattern indeed. And it looked just like that large juicy cockroach that had given him so much trouble only a few hours ago. And who knew that cockroaches could fly? And since when did a bat eat its lunch in broad daylight? And who cared? opportunities like this were rare. Lazily, Cuddlebug reached out one of his enormous talons and grabbed Measle neatly out of the air, and look, there's Cuddlebug grabbing Basil out of the air. And then the cockroach's spell wore off. It didn't happen all at once. The only evidence that the spell had run its course was that the cockroach, held firmly in Cuddlebug's grasp, began to get heavier. The bat's first reaction was, "Oh, great, a fatter lunch." But then the weight began to be a burden, and Basil's insect body started to swell so that Cuddlebug's talon began to ache under the strain of holding it. And then the weight became so much that the bat's other talon, which was holding fast to the beam above it, began to slip away. And then Cuddlebug lost his grip on the beam entirely, and together he and Basil began to fall towards the tabletop. Instinctively, the bat spread its great leather wings, which turned its downward fall into a glide. But lunch was getting too heavy and too fat, and it was somehow changing shape in Cuddlebug's grasp. So Cuddlebug brought his other talon into play and now grasped the body with both sets of claws. Yes, he had a better grip now, but his glide path was dropping fast, and he made a wide circle over the tabletop, looking for somewhere that would give him much needed height again. The open attic window. If he could only get through there in time before gravity completely overcame him. The bat flapped its great wings frantically and flew fast towards the broken window, gaining just enough height to clear, by a centimetre, the shards of dirty glass that stuck up from the base of the window frame like jagged spears. Out into the open air, Cuddlebug shot, and oh, the daylight, too bright, his eyes, he was blind, which way to turn? And, in his moment of confusion and sudden blindness, Cuddlebug forgot everything he knew about flying and lunch and the effects of gravity, and as Basil's insect body began to grow and stretched and softened and changed its shape back into its human form, Cuddlebug, flapping furiously in crazy circles, suddenly lost his battle with the pull of gravity and began to plummet towards the distant sound. Began to plummet towards the distant ground. Instinctively, Cuddlebug opened his claws and released his burden, and in that moment, Basil was Basil again. He felt the sudden slackening of the grip, and the grip of his beloved pet that had carried him safely until this very instant through the air. He felt the wind whistling past his face, and he glimpsed the ground rushing up to meet him. Basil had instincts too. Basil's instinct was to grab at something, anything, just so long as it would stop this headlong plunge, and he grabbed and clung tightly to the only objects within his reach, to the talons that had just let him go. And Cuddlebug shrieked a batty shriek of fear and fury and flapped his great leather wings as hard and as fast as he could, but it was no use. Gravity was winning this battle, and winning it in a spectacular fashion. There was a long way from the attic window to the hard concrete pavement far below, and Basil, now fully reformed back to his Wrathmonk self, no longer had his hard outer cockroach shell to protect him, and Cuddlebug had always been soft on the outside at least. Measle saw none of this, but he could hear it. Somewhere beyond the attic window he heard three sounds. Cuddlebug's shriek of terror was at too high a pitch for human ears to hear, so the first sound to reach Measle's ears was Basil's long howling scream as he plummeted to the earth. Ah! The other two came a moment later, one sound, the other soft, one loud, the other soft, but both were squishy. Splat! And then a second later, splat! Measle closed his eyes. His back hurt from where he'd rolled against the tree. He lay still for a moment. Then he felt something wet on his face, something wet and warm. He opened his eyes, and Tinker was crouching over him, licking his face. Tinker was getting bigger. Oh, that's us. We're on the last. Oh, right, okay. So I think we'll leave it there. Gosh, that was good, wasn't it? Okay. Basil's gone. And so's Cuddlebug. So why is Tinker's growing bigger? Could that mean that Basil's spell is wearing off now that he's gone? Well, That's us. We're on the last chapter now, so make sure you tune in for the next one, because this is where we now finish this wonderful, wonderful book. So tune in for the next one. Until then, stay home, stay safe, protect the NHS and save lives. Thanks very much. See you soon.